I am your host, Mr. Sherlock. Now, let's begin our journey.
It was a bitter December evening in 1894, the kind of night where the London fog seems to possess a physical weight, pressing against the window panes of 221B Baker Street like a living, shivering thing. Inside, the fire crackled with a cheerful defiance against the gloom, casting long dancing shadows across the mountains of discarded newspapers and chemical apparatus that cluttered our sitting room. Sherlock Holmes had been in a state of profound melancholy for 3 days. To the casual observer, he appeared merely idle, stretched out in his dressing gown, his thin, hawk-like nose pointed toward the ceiling as he blew perfect smoke rings from his long cherrywood pipe. To me, however, these periods of stasis were more exhausting to witness than his most frantic investigations. They were the stillness of a coiled spring, a mind so sharp that, lacking an external whetstone, it began to turn inward and grate upon itself. "I perceive, Watson," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence without him so much as shifting his gaze, "that you have decided against investing in the Turkish Bath Company after all." I started, nearly dropping my copy of the British Medical Journal. "How on earth could you know that?" "I haven't mentioned the matter since Tuesday. It is a simple matter of the correspondence on the mantelpiece," he remarked, waving a thin hand toward the clutter. "You received a prospectus 3 days ago. For 2 mornings you placed it atop your mail, indicating a desire to keep it in mind. This morning, however, I observed you using the envelope to jot down the measurements for a new bookshelf, and you have since moved it to the very bottom of the pile, beneath a bill for your bootmaker." When a man uses a financial prospectus as scrap paper, his interest in the investment has clearly evaporated. I laughed, shaking my head. "Your trivial deductions never cease to amaze me, Holmes." "They are not trivial, Watson. They are the alphabet of existence," he snapped, though a faint glimmer of amusement touched his grey eyes. "But alas, the alphabet is of little use when there are no stories to read. London has become a city of tedious virtue. Even the criminals seem to have succumbed to the festive spirit. Where is the imagination? Where is the—" A sharp, frantic drumming at our street door interrupted him. It was not the rhythmic knock of a gentleman, but the desperate pounding of someone in the throes of a great crisis. Holmes sat bolt upright, his lethargy vanishing like mist before the sun. "A client, Watson, and one in a significant hurry, if the tempo of that hall door is any indication." Moments later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young man whose appearance was the very picture of refined disarray. He was perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in an expensive astrakhan-trimmed overcoat that was unbuttoned and splattered with mud. His face was ash-grey, and his eyes held the wide, fixed stare of a man who had seen something that defied his understanding of the world. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, clutching the back of a chair to steady himself. "My name is Julian Vane. I have come from Highgate. My father, Sir Alister Vane, he has been murdered." Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers interlaced. "Sir Alister Vane, the amateur horologist and benefactor of the Royal Observatory. I am familiar with his work on pendulum synchronization." "Pray, compose yourself, Mr. Vane. Take a seat and tell us why you have bypassed Scotland Yard to come to me." "I have not bypassed them, sir," Vane replied, sinking into the chair I offered. "Inspector Gregson is at the house now. But he is lost. We are all lost. The circumstances they are impossible. I find that word is often used to describe things that are merely unusual," Holmes said, his voice now clinical and calm. "State the facts as they occurred." Julian Vane took a shaky breath. "My father was an eccentric man, as you may know. His obsession with clocks led him to build what he called the Sanctum of Silence in the west wing of Vanne Manor. It is a room designed with triple-thick walls and heavy padded doors to ensure absolute quiet so he could work on his most delicate instruments. Last night, he retired to the sanctum at 10 o'clock, as was his custom. He bolted the door from the inside, a heavy steel bolt that can only be operated from within. "And the windows?" Holmes asked. "There are none. The room is ventilated by a series of small, angled baffles in the ceiling, far too narrow for even a child to pass through. This morning, when he did not emerge for breakfast, we became alarmed. We called the locksmith, and eventually we had to break the door down. "And what did you find?" Vane shuddered. "My father was slumped over his workbench. He was dead, Mr. Holmes, but there was no wound, no sign of a struggle. The room was exactly as he had left it, the heavy bolt still firmly attached to the shattered frame." "A fit, perhaps, or a failure of the heart," I suggested. "So Gregson thought," Vane said, his voice dropping to a whisper, until he looked at my father's face. His expression was one of absolute soul-shattering horror. "And there is one more thing, something Gregson cannot explain, and something I cannot forget." "Go on," Holmes urged, his eyes narrowed. "The sanctum is soundproofed, Mr. Holmes. That is its entire purpose. Yet at precisely midnight, the servants and I, who were in the main hall 2 rooms away, heard a sound coming from that chamber. It was a single, beautiful, high-pitched note, like a glass harmonica or a celestial choir. It lasted for 10 seconds, piercing through those thick walls as if they were made of paper. And then silence. A silence so profound it felt like a physical weight." Holmes stood up, his face alight with a fierce intellectual hunger. A murder in a sealed, soundproofed room, heralded by a celestial note. "This is a problem of the first water, Watson." He turned to the young. "Tell me, Mr. Vane, did your father have enemies?" "None that I knew of," Vane replied. "But he was working on something. He called it his magnum opus. He said it would change the way we perceive time itself. He was terrified someone would steal his notes." Holmes grabbed his coat and hat. "The game is afoot, Watson. A silent death in a silent room, and yet the walls sang. If we are to catch a ghost, we had best start while the trail is still warm." As we descended the stairs into the biting London night, I glanced at Holmes. The boredom was gone, replaced by that cold, calculating intensity that always signaled the beginning of a hunt. But even I, who had seen him solve the most baffling mysteries, could not conceive how a man could be murdered inside a bolted, windowless vault, leaving nothing behind but a scream of music in the dark. The journey to Highgate was conducted in a silence, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of our horses' hooves against the cobblestones and the occasional low whistle from Holmes as he contemplated the facts of the case. The fog had thickened into a grey shroud, and the gas lamps of North London flickered like dying embers through the gloom. Vane Manor was a sprawling neo-Gothic edifice of dark stone, its sharp gables and narrow windows giving it the appearance of a brooding sentinel overlooking the heath. Upon our arrival, we were met by Inspector Gregson, a tall, flaxen-haired man with a mechanical precision that Holmes often found more tolerable than Lestrade's bull-headedness, though no less unimaginative. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," Gregson said, stepping out into the biting air, his breath blooming in white clouds. "I suspected we might see you. Young Vane is a man of quick action. I suppose he told you the essentials?" "He told me of a locked room and a midnight melody, Gregson," Holmes replied, stepping into the grand foyer. "A combination that would tempt a far more lethargic mind than my own. What is your current assessment?" Gregson shrugged, leading us toward the West Wing. "The surgeon is still examining the body, but it looks like a simple case of heart failure brought on by age and perhaps overwork. The man was 70 after all. As for the door being locked, well, eccentric old men often prefer their privacy. And the sound heard by the entire household? A trick of the wind in the chimneys, or perhaps a vibrating pipe," Gregson said dismissively. "The mind plays strange tricks in a house this size at midnight." Holmes offered a thin, enigmatic smile but said nothing. We reached the entrance to the sanctum. The heavy oak door had been splintered around the lock, the massive steel bolt still protruding from the wood, a silent testament to the room's impregnability. Stepping inside, I was immediately struck by the oppressive atmosphere. The room was perhaps 20 feet square, the walls lined with thick, quilted leather padding over what Julian Vane had described as triple-thick masonry. It felt as though the very air had been vacuumed out, leaving a heavy, dead stillness. Sir Alistair Vane sat slumped in a high-backed velvet chair at a sprawling mahogany workbench. The table was a chaotic landscape of brass gears, delicate springs, and skeletal clock frames. A single oil lamp burned low on the corner, casting a flickering amber glow over the scene. Holmes did not immediately approach the body. Instead, He stood in the center of the room, his eyes darting from the floor to the ceiling. He pulled a powerful magnifying glass from his pocket and dropped to his knees, examining the carpet near the threshold. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "The dust here has been disturbed in a most peculiar pattern." I looked down but saw only the thick pile of the Persian rug. "I see nothing unusual, Holmes." "Precisely, Watson. You see, but you do not observe. Look at the nap of the rug. It has been flattened not by a footstep, but by something broad and circular. And here." He pointed to a microscopic glint near the leg of the workbench, a tiny shard of clear glass, curved like the fragment of a bulb. He rose and moved to the ceiling, peering up at the ventilation baffles. They were intricate, angled slats of wood designed to let air in while trapping sound. "Gregson, have these vents been examined from the roof?" "My men looked, Mr. Holmes. They are barely 4 inches wide. Not even a cat could squeeze through." Holmes nodded, his attention now turning to the dead man. Sir Alister's face was indeed a mask of terror. His hands were clawed, his fingers digging into the blueprints laid out before him, the designs for his magnum opus. "A man of science, Watson," Holmes remarked, gently lifting the dead man's eyelid. "Look at the pupils, pinpoint contraction, and observe the water carafe on the corner of the desk." I looked at the glass bottle. It was half full, the water perfectly still. "What of it?" "Notice the level of the water," Holmes said, his voice sharp with excitement. "There is a faint ring of residue an inch above the current waterline. This water was agitated violently very recently. And yet, the workbench shows no sign of being shaken. I found myself increasingly baffled. Perhaps he had a tremor before he died? A tremor that causes water to leap an inch up the side of a carafe, but leaves a delicate brass pendulum standing upright 3 inches away?" Holmes shook his head, his eyes gleaming. He picked up a small, silver tuning fork that lay among the tools. He struck it against the table. The note was clear and pure, but within the padded confines of the room, it died almost instantly. "The sound heard at midnight was high-pitched and lasted 10 seconds, Holmes mused. "But this room is designed to kill sound. To be heard in the main hall, that note must have been of a volume that would shatter every eardrum within these walls. Yet Sir Alister's ears show no sign of hemorrhage." He turned to the workbench, his long fingers hovering over the blueprints. Suddenly, he froze. He leaned down, sniffing the paper. "Tobacco?" I asked, catching a faint scent. "No, Watson. Ozone. The sharp metallic scent of a lightning storm." He straightened up, his face set in a grim expression. "Gregson, I want a list of everyone in this house, family, servants, and any visitors from the last month, especially anyone with a background in physics or engineering. And Watson, keep your eyes on that carafe. The answer to this mystery lies not in what we can see, but in what we can hear, or rather, what we cannot." As we prepared to leave the room, Holmes paused by the shattered door, his eyes fixed on the heavy steel bolt. He touched it lightly, then looked at his fingertips. A look of profound realization crossed his features, but when I opened my mouth to question him, he held up a hand for silence. "Not yet, Watson," he whispered. "The shadows are beginning to take shape, but the light is not yet strong enough to reveal the face behind them." The following morning found Vane Manor bathed in a cold, unforgiving light that did little to dispel the gloom of the previous night's tragedy. Holmes had spent the early hours prowling the grounds, his coat collar turned up against the wind, while I remained in the library, attempting to provide some measure of medical comfort to the distraught household. It was in the library that Gregson convened our first formal inquiry. The household consisted of Julian Vane, Lady Beatrice Vane, the victim's much younger second wife, and a small, jittery man named Dr. Victor Holton, who had served as Sir Alister's scientific assistant for the past 3 years. "I have spent the night reviewing the domestic arrangements," Gregson began, looking rather pleased with himself as he tapped a notebook. "And it appears that while the room was locked, the motives for wanting Sir Alister gone were quite plentiful. Lady Beatrice, I understand there was some disagreement regarding the estate?" Lady Beatrice, a woman of striking but glacial beauty, didn't flinch. "My husband was a genius, Inspector, but he was also a miser. He intended to sink our entire liquid fortune into the construction of a harmonic clock that he believed would revolutionize maritime navigation. Naturally, I had concerns for our future. And you, Mr. Vane? Gregson turned to the son. Your father's journals mention a heated argument on Tuesday. Julian Vane paled. It was a private matter. He disapproved of my gambling debts, but I would never harm him. He was my father. Holmes, who had entered the room silently and taken a position by the heavy velvet curtains, suddenly spoke. And what of you, Dr. Horton? Your hands are trembling. Is it the cold, or is it the weight of the silver-plated regulator missing from the workbench? All eyes turned to the assistant. Horton was a man of nervous twitches, his spectacles thick enough to distort his eyes into watery orbs. I don't know what you mean, Horton stammered. I was in my quarters all night. I heard the sound, that terrible music, and I stayed behind my locked door. I was terrified. You are an expert in acoustics, are you not? Holmes asked, stepping forward. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. I noticed your thesis on the mantelpiece in the study. The resonant frequency of crystalline structures. A fascinating subject. It deals specifically with how sound can manipulate physical matter. Gregson's ears practically perked up. Acoustics? You mean like the sound we heard at midnight? Exactly, Gregson, Holmes said, his eyes fixed on Horton. Dr. Horton, tell me, why did Sir Alister dismiss you yesterday afternoon? The footman heard the shouting, something about intellectual theft. Horton collapsed into a chair, his face the color of putty. He was going to ruin me. He claimed the magnum opus was entirely his own discovery, but I did the calculations. I found the frequency. He was a brilliant horologist, yes, but he didn't understand the physics of the vibrations. Without me, his clock was just a pile of brass. He was going to fire me and keep all the credit. And so you decided to ensure he never took that credit? Gregson asked, leaning in. You knew the sanctum was soundproofed. You knew how to create a sound that could— What, Mr. Holmes? Kill a man. Sound can certainly shatter glass, Holmes remarked, and under the right circumstances it can cause a physiological collapse. But there is the matter of the locked door, Gregson. Even if Dr. Horton produced a sound, he was outside the room. But he has the technical knowledge, Gregson countered. And look at this. He produced a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket. Found this hidden in the doctor's bedside drawer. It's a detailed diagram of the sanctum's ventilation system with notations on the exact angles of the baffles. The evidence seemed damning. Horton had the motive, the expertise, and had clearly been spying on the very room where the murder occurred. Julian Vane looked at the assistant with dawning horror, while Lady Beatrice simply turned her head away in disgust. "It's a lie!" Horton cried. "I was studying the vents because I wanted to see if the sound of the clocks could be carried to the rest of the house. I didn't kill him." "Inspector," Holmes said, his voice strangely detached, "I believe you have your man, at least in the eyes of the law. The circumstantial evidence is indeed quite compelling." Gregson grinned, signaling two constables to step forward. "Dr. Victor Horton, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Sir Alister Vane." As the wailing assistant was led away, Gregson turned to Holmes. "Another case closed in record time, eh, Holmes? I'll admit your tip about the acoustics was the final nail." Holmes didn't answer. He was staring at a small, ornate clock on the library mantel. I walked over to him as Gregson departed to finalize the paperwork. "You don't seem satisfied, Holmes," I whispered. "The man had the motive and the means. The ventilation diagrams prove he was looking for a way into that room, even if only with sound." "It is too perfect, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "A man as terrified as Horton does not keep incriminating diagrams in his bedside drawer. He burns them. Furthermore, did you notice Horton's shoes? His shoes? They were ordinary black Oxfords. They were spotless, Holmes said, yet the carpet in the sanctum showed a circular disturbance in the dust, and the grounds outside are a quagmire of mud. If Horton had been near that room, he would have left a trail." "No, Watson. The inspector has found a victim, but I fear he has not found the murderer. There is a flaw in the geometry of this crime, a missing variable that Horton is too mediocre to have invented." He turned to me, his expression grim. "The celestial note was not a weapon, Watson. It was a byproduct. We must return to the sanctum. I have a sudden, urgent desire to examine the dead man's blueprints and to see if I can find the rest of that broken glass bulb. The arrest of Dr. Horton seemed to have satisfied the official inquiry, but as we walked back toward the sanctum of silence, Holmes's expression remained as inscrutable as a stone sphinx. Gregson had departed for the local station to process the prisoner, leaving us with a temporary reprieve to examine the crime scene once more. The house was unnervingly quiet. The servants had retreated to their quarters, and the heavy drapes of the west wing muffled the howling wind of the Highgate moors. "You are unusually quiet, even for a man in the middle of a case," I remarked, as Holmes unbolted the heavy outer door of the wing. "I am listening, Watson," he replied softly. "Not to the sounds of the house, but to the silence of the room. It has a quality all its own." Gregson sees a disgruntled assistant with a textbook on acoustics. He sees a motive and a map. It is all very tidy. But the universe is rarely so obliging as to be tidy. We re-entered the sanctum. The body of Sir Alister had been removed, leaving an eerie void in the velvet chair. The single oil lamp still flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the labyrinth of gears and springs. Holmes immediately returned to the workbench. He did not look at the blueprints this time. Instead, he began to methodically examine the floor beneath the desk. He moved with a feline grace, his magnifying glass inches from the carpet. "Aha!" he exclaimed, his voice ringing out in the dead air. He produced a pair of tweezers and held up a tiny dark object. "Another glass fragment?" I asked, leaning in. "No, Watson. This is organic. It is a scorched wing of a common housefly." He held it up to the light. "Observe the carbonization. This creature did not die of natural causes, nor was it crushed. It was subjected to a sudden localized burst of intense heat, so intense that the edges of the wing have fused into a glass-like bead. Perhaps it flew too close to the oil lamp? The lamp is encased in a glass chimney, Watson. This fly was found 3 feet away, near the leg of the workbench. And look here!" He pointed to the mahogany surface of the desk. Beside the water carafe, there was a microscopic pit in the wood, no larger than a pinprick, surrounded by a faint, silver-grey residue. Holmes scraped a bit of the residue onto a slip of paper and sniffed it. His eyes lit up with a sudden, fierce intelligence. "Watson, what do you make of the magnum opus?" He gestured to the complex assembly of brass and steel that Sir Alister had been working on. "It looks like a clock," I said. "A very complex one, perhaps, but a clock nonetheless." "Look closer at the escapement," Holmes urged. I peered at the mechanism. Instead of the usual swinging pendulum or balance wheel, the center of the device held a series of crystalline rods, arranged in a circular formation. They were connected by hair-thin wires of a metal that looked like platinum. "It isn't a clock at all," Holmes whispered. "Or rather, it is a clock that keeps time not by the movement of gears, but by the vibration of crystals. Sir Alister was not just an amateur horologist, he was experimenting with the very fabric of resonance. But look at this wire, Watson." He pointed to a snapped thread of platinum. The end was melted into a tiny sphere. "The inconsistency, Watson, is this. Gregson believes Horton projected a sound into this room through the vents to kill Sir Alister. But if a sound were loud enough to kill, it would have vibrated everything in this room equally. The water in the carafe would have been agitated. Yes, but why did the pendulums on the wall stay still? Why did the delicate springs on the table not dance?" "I cannot say," I admitted. "Because the energy was not acoustic," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. "The sound the household heard at midnight, that celestial note, was not the weapon. It was the exhaust. It was the sound of a massive surge of energy escaping a confined space. Sir Alister wasn't murdered by a sound from the outside. He was killed by something that happened inside this room, something that the blueprints do not fully account for." He walked over to the heavy steel bolt on the door. He examined the housing of the bolt, then the floor beneath it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small magnet. He ran it along the edge of the door frame. At a specific spot, a few inches above the bolt, the magnet snapped sharply against the wood. Holmes pulled the magnet away and stared at the spot. A grim smile touched his lips. "Do you see it now, Watson?" "See what?" I asked, frustrated. "The door was bolted from the inside. The room was sealed. If the murderer wasn't outside, and he wasn't inside, Then how? Oh, the murderer was very much involved, Watson, but their hand never touched this door. And as for Dr. Horton... Holmes looked toward the door where Gregson had disappeared. He is as innocent of this crime as you are, though he is guilty of a far more common sin, Vanity. Then you will tell Gregson? You will stop the arrest? Holmes tucked his magnifying glass away. Not yet. I need one more piece of the puzzle. I need to know why Lady Beatrice was so insistent on mentioning the liquid fortune of the estate, and I need to visit a certain laboratory in South Kensington. But what about the bolt, Holmes? How could the room be sealed if the killer... The bolt is the most elegant part of the deception, Watson. It is the lie that tells the truth. But come, we have a long night ahead of us, and I must adopt a persona that is slightly more electrical than my own. He refused to say another word on the matter, leaving me to stare at the bolted door in a state of utter bewilderment. Holmes had found a clue that changed everything, yet he was content to let a man go to the gallows, at least for the moment, while he chased the scent of scorched flies and magnetic wood. If the atmosphere at Vane Manor had been one of sombre mystery, the environment at 221B Baker Street over the next 12 hours was nothing short of chaotic. Holmes had undergone one of those startling transformations that I had learned to associate with the final stages of a complex case. The melancholy was gone, replaced by a feverish, almost frightening vitality. He had spent the night transforming our sitting room into a makeshift laboratory of the most hazardous sort. Piles of zinc-carbon batteries were wired together in series, their sulfuric acid fumes stinging the back of my throat. Coils of copper wire snaked across the Persian rug, and a large induction coil hummed with a menacing, low-pitched throb. "Holmes, surely this is excessive," I cried, dodging a sparking wire as I attempted to bring him a cup of tea. "The man is in jail. Gregson is satisfied. Why must you turn our quarters into a lightning god's workshop?" "Gregson is satisfied because he has found a shape that fits his narrow mold, Watson," Holmes cried, his eyes bright with a manic gleam. He was holding a glass tube filled with iron filings near a large magnet. "But the mold is wrong. The shape is a lie. I am close, so incredibly close, to capturing the ghost of Highgate." He suddenly dropped the magnet and turned to me, his face gaunt from lack of sleep. "Watson, what did you observe about the liquid fortune Lady Beatrice mentioned? Think carefully." "She said Sir Alistair was sinking their liquid fortune into his clock," I replied, puzzled. I assumed she meant his available cash and stocks, a natural assumption. But what if the liquid was literal? What if the fortune was not in the bank, but in a bottle? Before I could ask for clarification, a heavy thumping sounded on the stairs. The door burst open, and Julian Vane staggered in. He was dishevelled, his face bruised, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. "It's gone, Mr. Holmes," he cried, collapsing onto the settee. "The magnum opus. It has been stolen." Holmes did not look surprised. In fact, he looked almost gratified. "Despite the police presence, I presume." Inspector Gregson had 2 constables stationed outside the wing, Vane groaned. They heard nothing. No one entered or left. But when the inspector went to check the room an hour ago, the workbench was bare. The crystalline rods, the platinum wiring, all of it vanished. And there is more. He looked up at us, his eyes wide with a new terror. "My stepmother, Lady Beatrice. We found her in the library, unconscious. There was a smell in the air, the same sharp metallic scent you mentioned yesterday, the scent of ozone." I hurried to Vane's side, checking his pulse. He was shaken but physically sound. "Was she harmed?" I asked. "She is alive, but she cannot speak. She just stares at the ceiling, her hands clutching at the air as if. She's trying to catch something invisible." Holmes began to pace the room, his long strides taking him over the tangled wires. "The stakes are rising indeed. The thief has graduated from silent murder to a daring heist and an assault under the very nose of the yard. And yet," he paused, a cold smile playing on his lips, "they have made the one mistake I was praying for." "A mistake?" Vane asked. "They got away with the most valuable invention of the century. They got away with a shell," Holmes snapped. "The true heart of Sir Alistair's discovery was never in the brass or the crystals, it was in the residue. Watson, I must ask you to perform a task for me. It is of the utmost importance, and it may be dangerous. You know I am at your service, Holmes. Take your service revolver. Go to the Royal College of Science. Ask for Professor Moriarty's old assistant. No, wait, he's in prison. Ask for Professor Arkwright. Tell him you need a sample of stabilized mercury thallium alloy. If he asks why, tell him it is for the Baker Street alchemist. Bring it to me at the old clockmaker's shop in Clerkenwell, the one with the sign of the broken hourglass. But what about Lady Beatrice? I asked. And Horton? Horton is the bait in a trap he doesn't know he's in, Holmes said, grabbing his Inverness cape. And Lady Beatrice is a victim of her own curiosity. Move, Watson. Time is the one thing we cannot manufacture, and the clock is striking a very dangerous hour. As I rushed out the door, I looked back to see Holmes hunched over his induction coil once more. His shadow stretched long and distorted against the wall. He was no longer the clinical investigator I knew. He looked like a man possessed by a vision of the impossible. The investigation had moved beyond the walls of a locked room into a realm of science and shadow where I could not follow. I had my orders, but as I stepped into the biting cold of the London morning, a sense of deep unease settled over me. Holmes was playing a game with a master whose motives were still hidden in the fog, and for the first time in our long association, I feared that the logic of Sherlock Holmes might not be enough to save us from the silence that followed the music. Clerkenwell was a labyrinth of soot-stained alleys and narrow tenements, a district where the air smelled eternally of machine oil and coal smoke. It was the ancestral heart of London's watchmaking trade, and the broken hourglass was tucked away in its most shadow-choked corner. The shop's window was a graveyard of rusted gears and fly-blown dials, and as I stepped through the door, the cacophony of 100 discordant tickings greeted me like a fever dream. I clutched the heavy lead-lined canister containing the mercury thallium alloy, a substance Professor Arkwright had handed over with a look of profound suspicion. "Is the proprietor in?" I called out, my hand instinctively resting on the butt of the revolver in my overcoat pocket. A moment, wheezed a voice from the back. An ancient man emerged from behind a curtain of hanging pendulum weights. He was horribly hunched, with a shock of greasy white hair and skin like yellowed parchment. One of his eyes was obscured by a thick jeweler's loop, while the other squinted at me with a watery, suspicious greed. "I have the material," I said, feeling a surge of distaste. "I was told to meet a Mr. Holmes here." The old man chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Mr. Holmes is a busy man, sir, a very busy man. But Josiah is here. Josiah sees all the pretty metals. Let me see it." He reached out a gnarled hand, but I pulled back. "I will wait for my friend." "You are always so literal, Watson. It is a trait that makes you a formidable biographer, but a mediocre conspirator." The old man straightened his back with a series of audible pops. The watery eye cleared, the wheeze vanished, and the sharp, piercing gaze of Sherlock Holmes looked out from the mask of the decrepit clockmaker. He plucked the jeweler's loop from his eye and tossed it onto a workbench. "Holmes, your disguise was flawless," I breathed, stunned despite myself. "Speed is of the essence," he said, stripping off the tattered smock to reveal his own waistcoat beneath. "I have spent the last 3 hours spreading a very specific rumor through the clinkers, the local fences who specialize in precision instruments. I let it be known that Josiah of the Broken Hourglass has come into possession of the only stabilized mercury thallium alloy in London. It is the missing liquid for the Van Resonance chamber. You think the thief will come here? They have no choice," Holmes said, pouring the shimmering silvery blue liquid from my canister into a glass retort. "The magnum opus is a marvel of engineering, Watson, but it is incomplete. Sir Alister's notes, which I managed to skim before they were stolen, describe a liquid bridge required to focus the harmonic vibrations. Without this specific alloy, the machine is merely a heap of brass that produces nothing but ozone and dangerous electrical arcs." He placed the retort on a pedestal in the center of the shop, directly under a hanging gas lamp. "That ozone scent we smelled in the sanctum? That was the sound of the machine failing. The liquid bridge had ruptured, spilled onto the floor and evaporated, leaving that residue I found. The murderer has the machine, but they are currently holding a tiger by the tail. It is unstable, it is humming. And if they don't stabilize it soon, it will shatter every bone in their body. But who, Holmes? Horton is in a cell. Horton was a decoy, Watson. A man of his limited intellect could no more operate that machine than a toddler could pilot a steamship. No, we are looking for someone with a much deeper connection to Sir Alistair's secrets. Someone who knew that the liquid fortune wasn't money but this very alloy. He suddenly froze, his head cocking to the side. "The bell," he whispered. A faint chime rang out from the front of the shop. Holmes gestured for me to retreat into the shadows of the rear alcove. He pulled the tattered smock back on, slumped his shoulders, and returned to his persona of Josiah the clockmaker. A figure entered the shop. They were shrouded in a heavy travelling cloak, the hood pulled low, but as they stepped into the light of the gas lamp, I saw the glint of a silver-headed cane. "I am told you have the alloy," the visitor said. The voice was cultured, steady, and chillingly familiar. "I might," Holmes wheezed, patting the retort. "But it's a rare thing, sir, costs a king's ransom. Or a dead man's secret." The visitor stepped forward, and the light hit his face. I nearly cried out. It was Julian Vane, but the frantic, grieving son I had seen in Baker Street was gone. In his place stood a man of cold, predatory intensity. "My father was a fool," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He wanted to give this discovery to the world. He wanted to revolutionize navigation. He didn't understand that power is only valuable when it is held by the few. Now give me the retort." "And the girl?" Holmes asked, his voice still disguised. "Lady Beatrice? You had to silence her when she found you in the sanctum." "She was a secondary concern," Julian snapped. "The machine reacted when I tried to move it. A surge of energy. It stunned her. A pity, but necessary. Now the alloy. I have a carriage waiting. I'm afraid the carriage will have to wait for the Black Museum," Holmes said. He stood up straight, his voice ringing out with its natural commanding tone. "The game is over, Mr. Vane. Or should I say, the clock has finally run out." Julian Vane recoiled, his hand flying to his coat pocket. "Holmes, Watson, now!" Holmes shouted. I lunged from the shadows, my revolver leveled at Vane's chest, but Julian was faster than he looked. He didn't pull a gun. Instead, he snatched a small metallic sphere from his pocket and dashed it against the floor. A blinding flash of blue light filled the shop, accompanied by that same high-pitched celestial note we had heard in the night. The air tasted of lightning. I felt a wave of nausea and a ringing in my ears that made my knees buckle. When my vision cleared seconds later, the front door was swinging open. Julian Vane and the retort of alloy were gone. "After him!" I yelled, struggling to my feet. Holmes, however, was not moving. He was staring at the spot where the sphere had shattered, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Let him go, Watson," he said calmly. "Let him go. He has the alloy. He killed his father. He has a retort filled with colored sugar water and a trace of phosphorus," Holmes replied, brushing the dust from his sleeves. "And more importantly, he has a tracer. I took the liberty of magnetic plating the base of that retort. He is leading us straight to the magnum opus and to the evidence that will hang him." The pursuit led us back to the fringes of the Varney estate, not to the manor itself, but to a derelict stone observatory perched on a ridge overlooking the frozen ponds. Holmes led the way, his eyes fixed on a small brass compass he had modified with a coil of wire. The needle didn't point north, it strained toward the observatory, vibrating with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. "The magnetism is localized and immense, Watson," Holmes whispered, crouched behind a screen of leafless hawthorn. "He's attempting to prime the machine. If he succeeds in focusing the resonance without the proper stabilizer, he won't just kill himself, he'll level every stone of that building." We moved like shadows toward the structure. Through a jagged crack in the masonry, we saw him. Julian Vane stood over the magnum opus, which was now mounted on a heavy iron tripod. The machine was no longer silent. It emitted a low, bone-deep thrum that made my teeth ache. The crystalline rods were glowing with a pale, rhythmic violet light. "The alloy, you old fool!" Julian shouted, though there was no one but the machine to hear him. He held up the retort Holmes had given him, his face contorted with greed. "With this, the harmonic focal point will be absolute, a weapon that strikes through walls, leaving no mark, no bullet, no trace. Except for the smell of ozone, Julian." Holmes's voice rang out as he stepped through the threshold, his revolver steady in his hand. and the scorched wings of flies that happened to wander into the focal path. Julian spun around, his eyes wild. He went to pour the alloy into the machine's intake valve. "I wouldn't," Holmes cautioned, "unless you wish to see how phosphorus and sugar water react to a high-frequency ultrasonic field. I suspect the result would be explosive." Julian froze, the retort trembling in his hand. "How? How did you know?" "It was the geometry of the silence," Holmes said, his voice dropping into that clinical, detached tone he used when deconstructing a crime. "You wanted us to believe in a ghost or a mad scientist's sonic weapon projected from the outside. But the clues told a different story. The scorched fly in the pinprick pit in the workbench proved the weapon was already inside the room. It was a focused beam of ultrasonic resonance, a harmonic scalpel. "But the door," I protested, my mind still reeling. "It was bolted from the inside, Holmes. We saw the shattered frame." "The most elegant part of the play, Watson," Holmes remarked, never taking his eyes off Julian. Julian entered the room while his father was working. He brought the machine in a disguised crate, perhaps as a delivery of clock parts. He murdered his father by activating the device, which focused a lethal frequency directly onto Sir Alister's heart. Then he stepped out of the room, closed the door, and used a powerful electromagnet from the outside to slide the iron bolt into its housing. "The magnetic wood," I exclaimed. "Precisely. I found the traces of the magnetic field on the doorframe." Julian staged the locked room to divert suspicion toward the impossible, or toward the only other person with the technical knowledge, Dr. Horton. He even planted the ventilation diagrams in Horton's room to ensure the inspector had a trail to follow. Julian gave a harsh, jagged laugh. "You can't prove it. The machine is mine. The notes are mine. I don't need to prove the physics, Julian. I only need to prove the theft," Holmes countered. "The liquid fortune Lady Beatrice mentioned was not money. It was a cache of rare thallium alloy Sir Alister had hidden. You didn't know where it was, so you had to wait for me to find it, or rather, for me to manufacture a fake and lure you into claiming it. Your presence here with the stolen machine and my alloy is all the evidence Gregson requires. The sound, I asked, the celestial note at midnight? The machine's cooling system," Holmes explained. "When the focal point is achieved, the air itself vibrates at a frequency audible to the human ear, a byproduct of the energy buildup. It wasn't a herald of death, Watson. It was the machine's gasp for air." Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "If I cannot have the power of the opus, then no one shall." He lunged. Not for us, but for the machine's primary tuning fork, intending to snap the delicate crystalline rods. "Watson, the retort!" Holmes yelled. I didn't think. I fired, not at Julian, but at the glass retort in his hand. It shattered, drenching the glowing crystals in sugar water and phosphorus. The reaction was instantaneous. A blinding hiss of steam and a flash of white light filled the observatory. The low thrumming rose to a deafening shriek, the celestial note, returning one last time before the crystals shattered into 1,000 harmless fragments. When the smoke cleared, Julian Vane was slumped against the tripod, his hands over his ears, weeping in the ruins of his ambition. The magnum opus was a twisted wreck of brass and melted wire. Holmes holstered his weapon and looked at the debris with a touch of melancholy. "A pity," he murmured. "The science was magnificent. It was the soul behind it that was defective. The silence that followed the destruction of the magnum opus was more profound than any soundproofing Sir Alister Vane could have ever devised. It was the silence of a vacuum, a sudden, jarring absence of the terrible energy that had vibrated through the very marrow of our bones. In the center of the ruined observatory, Julian Vane remained on his knees, his hands trembling as he stared at the blackened brass and shattered crystals of his father's life's work. Inspector Gregson arrived 20 minutes later, leading a file of constables whose lanterns bobbed like fireflies against the dark Highgate slopes. He looked from the wreckage to the prisoner, and finally to Holmes, who was calmly lighting a cigarette while leaning against a stone pillar. "I assume, Mr. Holmes," Gregson said, puffing slightly from the climb, "that this is the unforeseen development you alluded to in your telegram." "It is the resolution, Gregson," Holmes replied, exhaling a plume of blue smoke into the freezing air. "You will find that Mr. Julian Vane has a great deal to answer for, not least of which is the cold-blooded murder of his father and the subsequent attempt to frame an innocent man. Murder? Gregson looked at Julian, who offered no resistance as the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. But the room, Holmes. The bolt was moved by a powerful electromagnet from the corridor. Gregson, a simple application of physics that allowed the murderer to seal the room after he had exited. You will find the magnet concealed in the base of Julian's silver-headed cane. As for the murder weapon, it lies in pieces at your feet. It was a device that used harmonic resonance to stop a human heart from a distance, a silent, invisible, and utterly terrifying tool of assassination. As the constables led Julian away, the young man stopped briefly in front of Holmes. The mask of the grieving son had utterly vanished, replaced by a cold, vacuous stare. "You haven't saved anything, Holmes," Julian whispered, his voice like the grating of rusted metal. "The blueprints are in my mind. The world is not ready for silence, but I would have given it peace." "The peace of the grave is not a gift, Mr. Vane," Holmes replied coldly. "It is a theft. We returned to Vane Manor to find a household in transition. Dr. Victor Horton had been released from custody and sat in the library, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. He clutched a cup of tea with both hands, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the police to return at any moment. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes," the doctor stammered. "I truly believed I was destined for the gallows. I had no idea Julian was capable of such scientific perversion. He was a man who saw the beauty of a formula, but lacked the character to respect its consequences," Holmes said, his voice unusually gentle. "You were a convenient scapegoat, Doctor. I trust you will find a more appreciative employer in the future, one who values your discretion as much as your mathematics." Lady Beatrice, too, had begun to recover. The stun she had received from the machine's discharge had left her with a lingering headache but no permanent damage. She sat by the fire, her glacial composure restored, though a new shadow of weariness played about her eyes. "It was the money, wasn't it?" she asked, looking at Holmes. Julian thought his father was squandering his inheritance on a dream. "Money was the catalyst, Lady Beatrice, but power was the motive," Holmes explained. "Sir Alistair intended to gift his discovery to the Admiralty to save lives at sea. Julian saw it as a weapon to be sold to the highest bidder. In his mind, his father was not just a miser, but a traitor to the family's potential for greatness. As we prepared to depart, I looked back at the sanctum of silence. The door had been boarded up, but the memory of the silent night murder would, I knew, linger in those halls for generations. We stepped out into the crisp morning air. The fog had finally lifted, revealing a world blanketed in a light dusting of snow, white, pristine, and quiet. "A successful conclusion, Watson," Holmes remarked as we climbed into our hansom, "though I fear the world has lost a brilliant mind in Sir Alistair." "And Julian?" I asked. "What becomes of a man who uses science for such darkness? He will face a jury of his peers, though I doubt they will understand the half of what he truly attempted. He sought to master time and sound, yet he forgot the most basic law of the universe. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. He struck at his father, and the resonance of that blow has shattered his own life." Holmes sank back into the cushions of the carriage, his eyes closing. The frantic energy of the last 24 hours was beginning to fade, replaced by the familiar mask of introspection. I looked out at the passing streets of London, thinking of the celestial note and the scorched fly. It was a reminder that even in our modern age of steam and steel, there were depths of human malice that no light of science could ever fully illuminate. The return to 221B Baker Street felt like a transition from a world of jagged, frightening echoes into one of ordered thought and comforting domesticity. The biting Highgate wind was replaced by the familiar scent of Holmes's strong tobacco and the faint, sharp tang of the chemicals he had left simmering on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Hudson, ever the silent heroine of our adventures, had anticipated our arrival with a tray of hot coffee and a rack of buttered toast, which we fell upon with the hunger of men who had spent a lifetime in the shadows. Holmes had discarded his overcoat and was already huddled in his armchair, his thin legs crossed and his chin resting upon his hands. The manic energy that had propelled him through the streets of Clerkenwell had vanished, replaced by a quiet, contemplative melancholy. "You know, Watson," he said, staring into the flickering embers of the fire, "there is a certain tragedy in the fact that the most brilliant minds are often the ones most susceptible to the rot of ego." Sir Alister sought to capture the music of the spheres, and in doing so, he became deaf to the discord growing in his own hallway. "It was a masterfully hidden discord," I replied, leaning back and savoring the warmth. Even now, as I reflect on it, the mechanics of the crime seem like something out of a dream. That magnetic bolt, Holmes, it still haunts me. To think that a man could be murdered in a room where every physical law seemed to bar the entrance of a killer. Nature never bars the entrance to logic, Watson. It only disguises it, Holmes remarked, reaching for his pipe. The bolt was iron, a ferromagnetic material. The door was oak, a non-magnetic barrier. Once you accept that the bolt could be moved without a human hand, the impossibility of the locked room dissolves. Julian's genius was not in the murder itself, but in his understanding of how the human mind recoils from the inexplicable. He gave us a miracle to distract us from a simple mechanical trick. "And the celestial note?" I asked. "The sound that Julian used to terrify the household? A byproduct of failure," Holmes said with a faint shrug. "The machine was designed to focus vibration into a silent, lethal point, but because the alloy bridge had ruptured, the energy bled into the surrounding air. It was the sound of a beautiful invention screaming as it was being turned into a weapon. There is a moral there, I suppose, if one is inclined toward the sermonizing of the Sunday papers." I smiled. "I think I shall stick to the facts for my chronicle, Holmes, though I must admit I found your Josiah persona quite convincing. I truly believed I was dealing with a derelict of the Clerkenwell slums." Holmes chuckled, a rare and genuine sound. "A bit of grease paint and a stoop go a long way, Watson, but it was your promptness with the alloy that secured the win. Without that bait, Julian would have remained in the shadows, waiting for the police to tire of Dr. Horton. As it stands, Gregson will have his conviction, and the Royal Observatory will eventually receive the recovered notes of Sir Alister, minus the more lethal applications, if I have my way." He rose and walked to the corner of the room, picking up his violin. He began to tune the strings, the notes discordant at first, then smoothing into a mournful, haunting melody that seemed to mirror the grey London morning breaking outside our window. "The case of the silent night," he mused, "the bow dancing across the strings. It has a certain ring to it, does it not? A night that was supposed to be silent, yet was filled with a music that brought only death." "It is a fitting title," I agreed, though I fear my readers will find the reality of the magnetism less romantic than the ghost they were likely hoping for. Let them have their ghosts, Watson. The world is full of people who prefer a comfortable mystery to a cold truth. But for us, the truth is the only melody worth playing." He turned his back to the room, lost in the music, his silhouette framed against the window as the first light of dawn touched the soot-stained roofs of Baker Street. The case was closed, the predator was caged, and the silence had finally returned. Not the heavy artificial silence of the sanctum, but the peaceful, living silence of a city awakening to a new day. I picked up my pen, the first lines of the narrative already forming in my mind. It had been a long and perilous journey through the mechanics of murder, but as I looked at my friend, his violin singing under his touch, I knew that for Sherlock Holmes, this was merely a brief intermission before the next great puzzle called him back into the fray. Christmas had come and gone, leaving London draped in a heavy soot-stained mantle of slush and fog. At 221B Baker Street, the festive season had been marked not by carols or grand parties, but by a quietude that Holmes seemed to relish. The silent night affair had left a lingering impression on both of us, a somber reminder of how easily the pursuit of harmony can be twisted into a cacophony of malice. It was on a particularly grey afternoon in early January that Inspector Gregson paid us a final visit. He appeared somewhat deflated, his usual brisk efficiency dampened by the complexities of the legal proceedings following Julian Vane's arrest. "The trial is set for the spring, Mr. Holmes," Gregson said, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson, "but the Crown is having a devil of a time with the indictment. How do you charge a man with murder when the weapon is a pile of shattered glass and the cause of death is essentially vibration?" Holmes, who was meticulously cleaning a microscope lens, did not look up. The law, Gregson, is often a blunt instrument attempting to dissect a microscopic problem. Tell the prosecutor to focus on the physical evidence of the electromagnet in the cane and the testimony of the household regarding the sound. The mechanics of the murder are secondary to the intent and the physical manipulation of the scene. Gregson nodded, scribbling in his notebook. We've also recovered what was left of the old man's notes. The Admiralty has sent a team of scientists to examine them, though they say the heart of the invention, the specific frequency calculations, perished with the machine. Perhaps it is for the best, Holmes remarked, finally looking up. His grey eyes were sharp. Sir Alistair was a man of the 19th century, dreaming of the 20th. But Julian was a man of the shadows, dreaming of a power that no century is truly ready to handle. Some silences, Gregson, are meant to remain unbroken. After the inspector departed, I sat by the fire, reviewing my notes for the narrative I intended to publish. The ledger of the case was finally complete, but some questions still gnawed at me. The final tally of the case, as I looked over my journal, I organized the disparate threads of the investigation into a final summary. The victim, Sir Alistair Vane, a man of pure science whose only flaw was a failure to perceive the resentment in his own blood. The weapon, an ultrasonic resonator, a device that focused sound waves into a frequency capable of disrupting the electrical impulses of the human heart. The deception, a locked room illusion created not by hidden passages, but by the clever application of magnetism to a standard iron bolt from outside the door. The fatal clue, a scorched housefly, a tiny witness to a massive surge of energy that left no other trace. The motive, a combination of financial greed and a megalomaniacal desire to weaponize a discovery intended for the salvation of mariners. You seem pensive, Watson, Holmes observed, putting away his cleaning kit. I was thinking of Julian Vane, I admitted, a man with such a mind, to throw it all away for a dream of power. It seems a terrible waste. Waste is the hallmark of the criminal mind, Holmes said, pacing the room. They possess the energy to create, yet they choose the path of destruction because it offers a swifter, albeit illusory, sense of mastery. Julian Vane did not want to understand the universe, he wanted to command it. And the universe, as we have seen, has a way of asserting its own equilibrium. He walked to the window, looking out at the throngs of people hurrying through the cold London streets. We live in an age of transition, Watson. We are moving from the era of the muscle and the steam engine into the era of the wave and the spark. This case was but a herald of things to come. A world where the most dangerous weapons will be the ones we cannot see, and the most impenetrable walls will be the ones we build in our own minds. And what of your part in it? I asked, looking at my friend with the admiration I could never quite suppress. Without your insight, Gregson would still be looking for a ghost, and an innocent man would be facing the noose. Holmes waved a hand dismissively, a thin smile touching his lips. I am merely a chemist of human nature, Watson. I take the elements as they are presented to me, apply the heat of logic, and observe the precipitate. If the result is the truth, then the experiment is a success. But the brilliance, if there is any, belongs to the facts themselves. I am but their humble translator. He picked up his violin and struck a single clear note. It vibrated through the room, pure and resonant, before fading into the comfortable hum of the house. The music is over, Watson, he said softly, and the silence that remains is a healthy one. Now, if you would be so kind as to hand me that monograph on the polyphonic motifs of the Middle Ages, I believe. I have neglected my own studies for far too long. I handed him the book, realizing that the case was truly behind him. The silent night had been resolved, the discord had been settled, and Sherlock Holmes was already seeking a new harmony in the vast, intricate puzzle of existence. Weeks turned into months, and the silent night murder began to recede into the annals of Scotland Yard's more bizarre footnotes. Julian Vane awaited trial in Newgate, his silence as impenetrable as the soundproofed walls of his father's laboratory. The press had moved on to a scandal involving a fraudulent medium in Chelsea, but at 221B Baker Street, the resonance of the case lingered in the form of a heavy, iron-bound chest delivered by the solicitors of the Varney estate. It was a cold February morning when Holmes finally broke the wax seals on the chest. Inside lay not gold or ledgers, but a chaotic wealth of papers, Sir Alistair's private journals, those which Julian had overlooked in his frantic quest for a weapon. "I find it fascinating, Watson," Holmes remarked, lifting a delicate vellum sheet covered in intricate geometric patterns. The son searched for the magnum opus, the great work, believing it to be a machine of power. He never realized that for his father, the work was not the machine, but the mathematics of peace. "What do you mean, Holmes?" I asked, looking up from my morning tea. "Sir Alister was not trying to stop hearts," Holmes said, his eyes scanning a series of equations he was trying to synchronize. "Look at these notations on the focal point of the resonance. He believed that if a room could be perfectly tuned to a certain frequency, it would induce a state of profound neurological calm. He called it the harmonic sanctuary. He wasn't building a vault for clocks, he was building a cradle for the human mind." This revelation cast the tragedy in an even grimmer light. The device Julian had turned into a lethal resonator was, in its original conception, intended to be a gift to the weary, a scientific balm for the frantic pulse of the modern world. "It is the classic inversion," Holmes continued, his voice tinged with a rare note of regret. "The same energy that can shatter a glass can also be used to sustain a note." Julian saw the shattering and ignored the song. It reminds one that the morality of a discovery lies not in the physics, but in the hand that turns the dial. We were interrupted by a visitor, though this one did not drum upon the door with the desperation of a client. It was Dr. Victor Horton. He looked transformed. The nervous twitch in his eye had vanished, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He had been appointed as the lead curator of the new horological wing at the British Museum, tasked with cataloguing Sir Alister's less controversial inventions. "I came to thank you one last time, Mr. Holmes," Horton said, his voice firm, "and to tell you that we have found the liquid bridge, the real alloy. Sir Alister had hidden it inside the pendulum of the Great Hall clock. It wasn't mercury thallium at all. It was a stable gallium-based compound that he had perfected in secret. A master of misdirection to the end," Holmes murmured with a nod of approval. "We are using it to complete his last project," Horton added. "Not the weapon, of course, but the clock of the long now. It is a timepiece designed to chime only once every century, a reminder to London that time is a river, not a race. We would be honored if you and Dr. Watson would attend the first winding." Holmes smiled, a thin, genuine expression. "I think, Dr. Horton, that I should like to hear a clock that is not in a hurry. It would be a welcome change from the frantic ticking of our current age." When Horton left, the room fell into a comfortable silence. Holmes returned to the journals, but he did not study them with the predatory intensity of a hunter. Instead, he handled them with the care of a scholar. "You see, Watson," he said after a long pause, "the true mystery was never the locked room. It was the human heart. It is the only vault that can truly never be picked, and the only mechanism that defies every law of logic. We can measure its pulse, we can map its resonance, but we can never truly predict when it will turn toward the light or toward the shadow." He stood up and walked to his chemical table, but instead of reaching for his vials, he picked up a small silver tuning fork, the one he had kept from the Varney Manor. He struck it softly against the wood. The note was high, pure, and lasted for a long, shimmering moment before fading into the stillness of Baker Street. "The music has its place, Watson, but the silence is where the truth waits for us to find it." I watched him as he stood there, a man of cold logic who had just spent the morning contemplating the soul of a dead clockmaker. I realized then that the case of the Silent Night hadn't just been a puzzle for Sherlock Holmes, it had been a mirror. In the reflection of Julian's malice and Sir Alister's vision, Holmes had seen a glimpse of the very thing he often tried to ignore, the fragile, beautiful, and terrifying complexity of being human. The spring of 1895 arrived with a suddenness that caught London unawares, replacing the biting winds of Highgate with a gentle, rain-washed warmth that coaxed the first green shoots from the window boxes of Baker Street. The trial of Julian Vane had concluded only days prior. It had been a somber, sensational affair that occupied the front pages of every broadsheet from the Times to the Gazette. The prosecution, guided by the anonymous suggestions provided by a certain consulting detective, had focused heavily on the physical evidence, the magnetic cane, the shattered crystals, and the testimony of the household. The jury had been sequestered for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty for the murder of Sir Alistair Vane. The judge, in his final address, had described the crime as a perversion of the intellect that chills the very marrow of a civilized society. Julian Vane had listened to his death sentence with the same vacuous, chilling detachment he had shown in the ruined observatory, his mind seemingly already dwelling in a silent world of its own making. "A satisfactory conclusion, Holmes?" I asked one afternoon, looking up from the British Medical Journal. Holmes was seated by the window, his long, thin fingers tapping a rhythmic tattoo upon the arm of his chair. He had spent the morning cataloguing his collection of rare toxins, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. "In the eyes of the law, Watson, yes," he replied, his gaze fixed on the street below. "The murderer is accounted for, and the innocent are restored. But in the eyes of science it is a tragedy. A man of Sir Alistair's calibre appears but once a generation. To have his life extinguished by the very curiosity he fostered in his son. It is a discordant note that even the most logical mind finds difficult to resolve." He turned away from the window, his eyes brightening with that familiar predatory spark. "However, the world moves on, and it seems the inhabitants of this city have a limitless capacity for generating new puzzles. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of this?" He reached into the pocket of his dressing gown and produced a heavy, soot-stained envelope. It was sealed not with wax, but with a thick, dark substance that looked remarkably like dried tar. "It arrived by messenger while you were at your practice," Holmes said, handing it to me. "The boy said the sender was a man with eyes like a hawk and hands like a coal miner. A curious description, wouldn't you say?" I broke the seal with a pocket knife. Inside lay a single charred page from what appeared to be an old shipping ledger. The paper was blackened and brittle, the edges curled by heat, but the handwriting upon it was still legible, a precise copperplate script that listed names, dates, and a series of cryptic coordinates. "It looks like an inventory of some kind," I remarked, squinting at the faded ink. "But look at the dates, Holmes. These are from 1870, and this name, the Mycroft Star. Surely that is a coincidence." "In London, Watson, there are no coincidences, only connections we have yet to map," Holmes said, his voice dropping into that low, urgent tone that always signaled the beginning of a hunt. "The Mycroft Star was a merchant vessel that vanished off the coast of Sumatra 25 years ago. It was carrying a cargo of industrial diamonds and, if rumors are to be believed, a secret treaty destined for the Governor-General. And why send a page of its ledger to you now? And why in this condition?" Holmes stood up, his lethargy vanishing as he moved toward his chemical table. He held the charred paper over a spirit lamp, observing the way the heat affected the ink. "Because, my dear Watson, the paper is not charred by fire," he whispered, his eyes narrowing. "It has been treated with potassium ferrocyanide to give it the appearance of age and damage. It is a fake, a deliberate, meticulously crafted forgery. But the coordinates written in the margin, those are fresh. They were added within the last 48 hours. "A challenge?" I suggested. "Or a warning," Holmes replied. He looked at me, a wolfish grin playing on his thin lips. "The Silent Night was a study in physics and family tragedy, Watson, but this has the scent of an old ghost reaching out from the sea. It seems the case of the blackened ledger is about to begin." He grabbed his deerstalker and his heavy walking stick, his movements filled with a renewed electric vitality. "The game is afoot, Watson. The fog may have lifted from Highgate, but it is thickening once more in the docks of East London. Shall we see if we can find the man with the coal miner's hands?" I set down my medical journal and followed him toward the stairs. The memory of the Varney tragedy remained, a sombre echo in the back of my mind, but as we stepped out into the crisp spring air of Baker Street, the thrill of the unknown took hold once more. Sherlock Holmes was right, the music of existence never truly stops, it only changes its key. And as long as there were shadows in London, I would be there to record the light that he cast upon them.